everybody, it's Angelica Pina Perez, and I'm back for part 2 of my radical ramble, my kind of little walk through the forest with you today. So we're continuing to decolonize the imagination and the arts, and I think that they really do live in the ecosystem of what we know or what we use as the expressive arts. And so as the recovery wears on in both Puerto Rico and really within our internal and external systems, right? Always in a process of recovering, hopefully not covering up, we're trying to expand our language and our vocabulary, specifically morphing our metaphors with emerging lived experiences that is vital to decolonizing our profession. And so how we speak, right? And how we think about our work must stay relevant and responsive to the current events that shaped it. So here I'm curious in part 2 about how the collective lived experience, particularly inspired by the collective lived experience of Puerto Ricans on the island of Puerto Rico and in the Latinx diaspora and through ancestral lineage, can be a metaphor to understand the need to decolonize our imagination, the arts, psychology, and our world. And I wondered what and how we as an expressive arts community can learn from the strength and resiliency of an oppressed and colonized population living through, quote, natural disasters, and with structural disasters, right? And when these combine into environmental racism, the chronic complex trauma requires holistic care and consideration in order to reorient after such a disorientation. And so environmental racism comes in here is because climate change disproportionately affects communities like island communities or low-lying communities that tend to be more socioeconomically oppressed communities, repressed and exploited throughout the world. So let's kind of just take a moment to kind of go back to something I said earlier that's kind of popping up again for me, which is kind of like that walk through the forest together, right? So I love to kind of deconstruct to reconstruct, and I do that a lot with words, and I do that with my clients and with my students. And thinking about the forest, right? In the English language, if we're using it as we're using it right now, I kind of hear and see two words, right? For and rest. And for some people, the forest is a place of refuge, and it is for rest, I guess, right? But I think not. I'm not sure. Kind of riffing off of here, but I don't think it's for all people, right? When we think of like forests or resting, right? The way I think about it, at least, and the kind of general way that it's been reported back to me when people imagine a forest are kind of like these more European or North American ways of thinking about forests, like with hiking trails. And there's really this romanticized idea of reconnecting with the self by disconnecting from everyday modern life. or that the conundrum for me is that anything that you have to escape, and that you can escape from, is actually a privilege, right? That disconnecting, escape, disconnection is a privilege, actually, and that nature has been commodified. It's now a commodity and currently consumed by people who can afford to escape to it, and therefore recolonized again, because these lands are colonized lands as well on in the Western Hemisphere, North and South. So this all requires time and resources, like transportation, gear, clothing, all to have quote unquote fun, right? It almost kind of feels like a fetishization of nature, right? Because also, what does this mean for people who don't have the socioeconomic means to get to nature, or who are far from nature, or who are within nature and are living below the poverty line in different regions of this country? I mean, I just kind of feel like it doesn't sit right with me. It feels like it creates greater divides by utilizing and elevating nature, quote unquote, with one particular way of using it or thinking about it. And is that the most, quote, natural way to do the work? I mean, I don't know, how are we thinking about this, right? Like, how do we build communities that are within nature and green spaces, shared in nature, but that doesn't also kind of demonize, devalue the existence or the lived experience of the urban, right? Because in elevating forests, we're kind of, our nature, the way I hear it, having been born and bred on the Lower East Side of New York City, very much an urban environment, sometimes disgustingly and racistly, is that even a word, folks? Called an urban jungle, right? That connotation, that metaphor is it has racialized and racist tones. I don't know, it just kind of feels like one is better than the other. And isn't that exactly what we're not trying to do? And also, if we elevate kind of like forests as the nature metaphor, or that nature, that type of nature, what about hiking up like volcanoes or through a rainforest, right? Like I did when I visited and worked and had the privilege of being in communities in Guatemala, or in the desert when I had the privilege and the honor of working in and with communities in Egypt, or the tundra, or the oceans. All of these are different natural parts of the earth. But why is it that we tend to only imagine one kind of nature when we talk about it in the expressive arts? Because that type of nature is really then talked about as a retreat, right? To rejuvenate and restore. But honestly, it doesn't feel that way of using or thinking or playing with nature is not about liberation, but it's really classist and colonial. And therefore, so are our specializations, right? Think about the materials we purchase, especially the quote-unquote cheapest ones, to stretch out our budgets, right? I've been there. I've done it run to the dollar store at the corner from your agency in order to get some more crayons, paper, whatever it is, right? Those are the cheapest materials are actually some of the most toxic ones for the consumers to use. So then think about which populations are utilizing those cheaper materials, right? And also just generally just how our materials are produced. Think about the carbon footprint as expressive artists and expressive arts therapists, or the oils that are required in making our visual art materials, our clay, our papers, are in not just in the production of the clay pot itself, right, but also in the manufacturing, right, of paper, let's say, right, which also requires deforestation. I mean, all of this is connected, folks, right? And so if we're going to elevate and be environmentalists, right, and elevate nature also as a part of a neoliberal environmentalism agenda, and yet kind of not think about our materials as part of that, it's a problem. And not just that. I mean, there's also like the classist component to it. Like, who gets to buy those materials? When? How? Why? I mean, so there's multiple intersectional layers to this, right? And so my thing is as I think about being an expressive art therapist and I think about teaching future expressive arts therapists, I mean, what did the earliest humans utilize to express their joy, right? What did they utilize to make meaning of their suffering? These materials didn't exist. You know, at least the materials, the way we kind of think about them in the context of industry, products, and consumption, right? But all of these humans across time and space were creative, right? They were expressive, right? We would not have evolved in every aspect of our human existence if our ancestors were not creative expressionists, right? And creative problem solvers, right? Who worked creatively and collectively. And then, like, to also think about with our materials, what kind of waste are we producing? That's also, oh gosh, that's like a whole other podcast because I have to kind of move on with some of these metaphors. But because another metaphor in thinking about like the earth and the environment, right, is thinking about women's bodies and the earth and reimagining Mother Earth this way, and really critiquing the patriarchal hegemony entrenched in the nature of expressive arts therapy, right? What if it's because we have internalized misogyny that we act out our aggression and our hate towards women on Mother Earth, right? I mean, we've all heard the expression, we're raping the earth. And it's, you know, kind of an echo now of something that just feels quite connected to the Me Too movement, right? And why is it that, you know, those intersectional ways of thinking about how we're using metaphor or how we speak about things, or experiences, are in one context kind of unspeakable and in other contexts kind of flippantly used. Because our earth is our home, and we know it's being ruined, but kind of thinking about environmentalism has always been really a rallying cry for the earth, but it's really about justice also for the poor. I mean, our common home has fallen into disrepair. And there's always hope that we can do something and to redirect our steps to make better choices. But we're at a pivotal point. We here at the Create Collective, but also in my circles, I accept modern science, the modern science of climate change. And so the urgency around it and the steps in the right directions are to kind of think about it in our work, right? With the products that we use and how we use those products and how we recycle those products. And to speak out about this and immediately take action about it, that anything that we create or co-create is with respect and in the context of our environment, literal and metaphoric. And ideally, then we want to kind of use some indigenous knowledge building here and leave it better than we found it, right? Leave our planet better than we found it. But leave our internal landscape better than what it is now and how we found it because of what it's been done unto us and what we've internalized. I don't know. I don't know if it makes too much sense, but something instinctually tells me that there's something here. Some other examples of how we use environmental metaphors or nature-based metaphors in our work are, and think about the elements of earth, air, fire, and water and how they're often utilized. And yet we are not literally taking care of these elements. But we use them with care as metaphor, right? Our planet is speaking to us. Just like we tell ourselves to listen to our bodies, let us now listen to our planet as the ultimate body. When we think of our self-care, can we transpose or translate those practices into how we care for the planetary body, for the communal body, right? How can we take better care of the earth, the sun, the wind, the water, the biomass, the coral reefs, the ozones, the forests, all parts of the earth? How are we different from corporations that focus on one element for their profits? When we practice only one specialized way, one specialized form, with the excuse or through the veil of a professional scope of practice and standards. Let's not break up the whole. Let's not exploit the parts. I mean, the expressive arts is the creative microcosm, can be considered a creative microcosm for our planetary ecosystem. And I would argue that, or I'm kind of thinking about how the specializations decimate the ecosystem, sometimes permanently. Acknowledging that the specializations are the legacy of colonialism and the fracturing of the human condition means we take responsibility for reparations to those that we have harmed in the replication of a system built to harm. If our intent as expressive arts therapists is to help, then the help has the impact of a ruse. It is in the expressive arts that our natural, original way of being in the world is, also was, and can be practiced. We can no longer help with our, quote, one way or, quote, specialization. We must do no harm by returning to the organic, natural state of a holistic human condition, where all the elements earth, air, wind, fire, exist in their relationship to each other. Life as we know it can only exist on this planet because of these elements, because they are, and continue to be together. In combination, they create the life force or life energy as both givers and takers of life, right? The very water that is, and air that we breathe and water we drink, in combination, created with a powerful other weather system, something called a hurricane. And it has the potential to destroy. And together it can also have the potential to create. It's both. I think the abuse of power comes in when we focus or elevate on one or the other, focusing on things that are supposed to be thought of as in a collective when we think of them as singular. Like, for example, the metaphor that we use a lot in our work is something called grounding, right? Which arguably focuses on the element of earth, the earth. But what if grounding, because it's a singular way of thinking about stabilizing a client or feeling a sense of safety, was actually harmful because it perpetuates an illusion of safety, right? And not necessarily really helps people feel quote unquote safe. Listen, a brief survey of our literature reveals multiple theories and approaches to quote unquote grounding a client, and that grounding is really a technique that helps someone stay in the present, right? That they help orient a person to the here and now reality of what's going on. That grounding skills can be helpful in managing overwhelming feelings or intense anxiety, and that they help someone regain their mental focus from an often intensely emotional state. And that grounding skills occur within two specific approaches, which include sensory and cognitive awareness. But what if, kind of in decolonizing the metaphor of the ground, and decolonizing our kind of romantic ideas about what the ground is as a stabilizing force, we begin to think of the ground as actually quite weak, right? It's weak beneath our feet. Deep, deep below in the inner crust of the earth, it is always shifting. And over time, and with pressure, right, these tectonic plates are always moving until over pressure and time, so much energy is built up that they shift dramatically, therefore completely changing the landscape of the crust of the earth. And I mean, I think about this all the time, that like, where am I safe? Like the earth can shake beneath my feet at any time, and the structure can crumble, and I can die because of that, right? I mean, the ground also is a barrier, right? In quantum physics, right? It's actually is what's preventing us from falling through space. And it's gravity, the unseen force, right, that keeps us from floating away. It's gravity, actually, that arguably is grounding us. But it's something unseen. It's something ephemeral. It's something else. It's not the ground, right? Or what if we think about it a whole other way completely? What if we utilized, I mean, it's still kind of fracturing them all and not using them as a collective, but I'm just kind of talking out loud right now and utilizing and elevating the air element, right? And that floating, or water, right? The water element, that floating, is a way that keeps someone present rather than using the word floating, let's say, to describe disassociation, right? But rather that it's just another way of being. Or that you still thinking about the water element now, going with the flow, right? Riding the waves, going against the current, maybe is more of a decolonialized way of thinking about how we actually are in the world. I don't know, like fire, right? It gives us warmth and light, and cooking helps us to cook. All of these life-giving essential practices that help us stay in the present moment. I mean, all the elements really do have the power to create and destroy. But I guess what I'm saying is that when we focus or elevate just one of these, it presents a skewed reality and a distorted sense of safety. Right? The ground is not secure and stable. And maybe using it as a metaphor for safety is really a disservice. Because maybe there are no safe spaces. No, I can say that. There are no safe spaces. There are only safer spaces where we work and live intentionally to do less harm, compassionately and humanely. And then when we transgress and the ruptures occur, which are inevitable because we're human beings in relationship to one another, that we honor them as natural shifts of geological forces, and that from destruction can come creation, and the evolutionary capacity to keep going gets reinforced in our DNA. Biologically, we would not be here if we did not have this capacity. Now we commonly refer to it as resiliency, grit, tenacity, strength. Actually, they are just human capacities that are cultivated in community. No human evolved alone. Someone came before, someone will come after. Someone collaborated with someone else in their mutual survival and in their mutual thriving. The capacity is in our DNA and neurobiology, but we are skewing what we remember by how we remember it. Telling ourselves certain stories about how to cope, focusing on one specialized way to process the pain. These are the distortions that cause more pain. Rooting ourselves in one way can actually kind of, when the trauma occurs, create and the uprooting that is so devastating. Maybe rootlessness is something to aspire to. Because rooting, maybe, can also be a metaphor that kind of keeps us in our place. Right? Yeah, we grow. I think in one way, in some ways it works, but in other ways it doesn't, right? Do we have to kind of stay in one place? I'm not sure. Do we stay in one place psychologically? I'm not sure. Should we? I mean, I just am trying to be like unequivocal about the linkages between how we think and talk about ourselves and our environment, both externally and internally, and what are the roles that we play in expressive arts in perpetuating neoliberalism, capitalism, and consumption. All of these are crises in our applied work, in our philosophical frames, and in our internalized narratives. The imagination has been colonized, and the process of internalized intersectional oppressions over 500 years of Eurocentric hegemony has had its effects, and we see it in our work. The goal here then is to claim the expressive arts specifically as a tool of resistance, if reimagined from its grassroots. Right? So as an expressive arts therapist, I believe the way to mend the emotional ruptures is to wade deep into the waters of our pain, and where we feel the muddy and the sand, and we still can breathe the air, but we're in the midst of it. It's all around us. We can see the water, but we can also see through it. By doing so, we irrigate the wounds and can cathartically transmute our own suffering with making meaning from it. I mean, I believe that the fundamental human right to express ourselves with the full range of human emotions that we have within us can and should happen. I work on supporting clients and students to harness that power that is already within them, to cultivate the change they want to see within themselves and the world. Expression is a critical ingredient in the emancipation and liberation from internal and external oppressive forces that impinge on our right to live our best lives, not just by ourselves, but with each other. So, let's recreate our world together, one metaphor at a time.